My name is Eric Chessen. I'm the founder of Beyond Boundaries Fitness, fitness and wellness for the young autism population. And I'm one of the few, if the only fitness specialist that I know of who's working exclusively with this population. I started out as a fitness professional working with general population. This is some 6 or 7 years ago. And I had a colleague who was interested in me bringing my practitioner skills into a program for teenagers on the autism spectrum. And I began working with these individuals in a fitness capacity using ABA methodology to develop and implement my curriculum. And I said, this is fantastic, and I love working with this population. Where's the research? Where are the best practices for methodologies in incorporating fitness and wellness programs for this population? And I found nothing. There was absolutely nothing there in the way of data or research or any other professionals who had chosen to focus on this particular demographic in any type of way, shape, or form, really. You had sporadic physical therapy and sporadic OT, and every story that I heard from parents was, oh, they were in physical therapy, I don't know really that it helped that much, or they aged out of it. And there's this huge component of physical fitness as something that is conducive towards all these life skills that was being left out. And I said, all right, well, nobody else is doing this. I have a passion for working with this population. I have a passion for bringing fitness and wellness into people's lives. I guess I'm the go-to guy, so that became my mission since 2003 when I formed my original company. And then since then, it's blossomed into Beyond Boundaries Fitness. And now my mission is to bring fitness to as many children and individuals on the autism spectrum as possible.
Did you started out in fitness as a result of your education?
I started out in fitness primarily for my own health. I started out as a sedentary, overweight kid who had played a couple different sports. I was definitely not an elite athlete. And then in high school and college, I began getting into resistance training and fitness as a lifestyle, and I felt great. I was developing self-esteem, I was developing self-efficacy, and I really loved the energy that I was feeling. I loved the way I felt. All aspects of life just got better. I was thinking more clearly with a combination of sound exercise practices and nutrition. It became a lifestyle, and it became something that I wanted to share with friends, with family, and especially with this population. So originally, I was working with the general population, and then when I got this opportunity, I said, this is something that is such a dire need and a necessity. I've spoken with parents that I've worked with, whose children I've worked with, and I said, what I'm doing is kind of looked at as a luxury. As a fitness specialist working with the autism population, it's a luxury, but it's actually a necessity, because these children are not moving. The research is showing that there are prevalent and pervasive movement deficits in the autism population when compared with normal or neurotypically developing children, and there's nobody addressing it. And there are all these aspects of fitness, from the gross motor skills to the cognitive processing to emotional functioning, that are all heavily impacted by fitness and wellness. And this is certainly a modality for a greater life, towards benefiting the future for each and every one of these kids.
So tell me how you work with these children, how you evaluate them, what their needs are, and
right.
How do you go from there?
It's this wonderful balance, because you're always working with a human body, and we all move basically the same way. It's all kinematics, it's all basic human movement, but then there's the learning curve, and then there's the individual nuances of movement, and then there's motivation. What motivates you to move or not move? When I'm dealing with an individual one-on-one, first I'm looking at, okay, what are the structural issues that we're looking at? Is the gait off? Is a foot turned in or out? Is there Are there hip flexibility issues? Is there one shoulder turned in, one shoulder turned out? What am I looking at as far as their attentiveness, their ability to look at me or to look at any other object? So a basic assessment is, okay, what can I see immediately? And then we'll go through a couple basic movement patterns. What I've found, some of the prevailing deficits in the autism population are the ability to squat or bend the knees and then to extend the limbs. Most of what I'm focusing on when I begin a session with one of my new athletes is, can we move in the 5 basic motor patterns, which are pushing, pulling, rotation, level change, and locomotion. Locomotion is generally the last component that I incorporate because typically gait is so poor as a combination of the physiological deficit that exists, because many of these kids have the the toe walking, the knees turning in, the tight hip flexors, and that's to begin with. But then when we take a child and place them in a classroom for 6 to 8 hours a day, and then they have after-school activities, they're stuck in hip flexion, there's internal rotation of the shoulders, and they're kind of in this bunched-in posture. And then when you combine that posturally with also that emotional affect of not wanting to socialize, not opening up, you can see a direct correlation with the inability or the lack of motivation to communicate with others. And then look at the physiological deficits. Everything's kind of turned in, kind of tight, kind of inwardly rotating.
Do you see a difference between the children that are able to sit in one place for a long time, that don't seem to have the really bad attention deficits, and then the children with ADHD that are just bouncing around the classroom all day long, and maybe they're not sitting and
right.
sitting on,
right.
You know what I mean? Do you see a difference with those?
Absolutely. It's all about the stimulus that's present and their ability to orient themselves to a task, and certainly task adherence is a huge part of my program. So I think the biggest misconception about what I do is getting kids better at sports. That's not the intention. Sports are, and I've discussed this so many times, sports are up at the top of the pyramid as far as human performance and functioning. And down here we have that sedentary lifestyle, we have that inactivity, and somewhere in the middle we have to develop that balance, that long-term development of human movement. I've worked a lot with parents who say, oh, I want my child to be playing soccer, or I want to incorporate them in Little League and play baseball. I want to get them into a sport. I can definitely understand that from the socialization aspect and from being able to initiate with peers. But the problem is from a physiological standpoint and also from an emotional standpoint, which I'll get to in a second. But first, from the physiological standpoint, parents and practitioners have to realize that sports are very, very finite, very specific movements. It's akin to, I use the analogy of a math class. You wouldn't take a class of second graders and all of a sudden, first day of class, okay, we're doing trigonometry, because we don't have the prerequisites. They haven't been set yet. They haven't been mastered. But if we look at long-term development and say, all right, we're going to start developing gross motor patterns, squatting, bending, rotation, locomotion, pushing, pulling, all of these, I call them the big 5 movement patterns, then we're developing the general fitness and the general movement patterns necessary to perform these highly, highly specialized movement patterns that we see in sports at the top of the pyramid. So what I'm kind of trying to do is bridge that happy medium, because when we try to go from 0 to 90, from inactivity to sports, and this is with both neurotypically developing children and special needs, it doesn't matter, because again, we're talking about human kinetics and we're talking about basic gross motor functioning. If we get up to that sports level, or if we introduce a child into that sports level and they're not ready, we're going to see more instances of muscular imbalance. We're going to see a problem with postural integrity. We're going to see a higher rate of injuries, which has been demonstrated in the neurotypical populace. Right now, there's a huge instance of ankle sprain, of patella injuries, of ACL tears. And this is because you're putting kids in a situation where they have the acceleration, but they don't have the brakes, and they don't have they do not have the prerequisites to be on a soccer field and play that level of game. on the emotional front, for any individual, again, neurotypically developing or otherwise, if we establish that they have already mastered these movement patterns and we get to that level of sports play and competitive games, then they are able to participate, they're able to have fun, and they have that development of self-efficacy, of self-esteem. I can do this, I'm good at this, I'm good at something. But if we take them 0 to 90, where at 90 we're playing sports and they fail, that's a huge, huge blow to their self-esteem, number one. And number two, it's an indoctrination to movement that we don't want, because it's saying this is the only thing there is. It's either soccer or baseball or nothing. And that's what we're doing with the neurotypical population. So when you get into special needs, it becomes twice or exponentially more difficult to establish a joy of movement.
Where do you, the children that you work with, where do they come from? From the school system, from the park district?
Well, it starts out with schools across the country. Right now there is such a paucity of the physical education system, and fortunately we have a group now like the IYCA, the International Youth Conditioning Association, who are reinventing physical culture for the young people of the nation. Basically what's happened is, through whatever mechanisms, budget cuts, or kind of a misunderstanding and misrepresentation of what fitness is, it's fallen to the wayside in our youth culture. And the only kids who are gaining access to fitness are the ones who are pigeonholed into sports. So if you have a kid who is good at football, or a kid who is good at baseball, or a kid who is good at soccer or track and field, then they are put into that small area of athletic development, and all the other kids kind of fall to the wayside. They're not athletes anymore. If you look at a class of 5-year-olds, say, how many of you little guys are athletes? And they all raise their hand because they're out playing and they're engaged in many different sports, hopefully, many different movement patterns. They all raise their hand, and then 2 or 3 or 4 years later, you ask that same class, and maybe 2 kids raise their hand because they're both in specialty sport leagues. So right now, that's where the educational world is, at least in the mainstream, with fitness and physical culture. So then when you look at special needs, there are some programs that are starting to look more into physical education as part of their curriculum. So that's where I'm starting to develop programs for. I'm beginning to do consulting and beginning to integrate physical fitness programs, because then people, either the directors of programs or people who are involved with the programs, say, wow, we really need to get these kids moving. Okay, how do we do it? Because the information really isn't out there, and that's where I come in. So I'm working with educational programs, I'm working with some after-school programs, and then of course I have some of my clients, my athletes with whom I work one-on-one as well.